So, oops, that is work cool. So, what's Tailwind CSS? It describes itself as a utility-first CSS framework, and what that means in practice is that this HTML snippet here, like you can see the class attributes inside, that's Tailwind. And it actually allows you to write like really elaborate websites, like to style them with only CSS classes. And usually the first time people see something like this, they just crash, like, their mind crashes. Like, why would somebody use something like this, where we can like write it in a separate file and give it short names and so on. So this talk is about like how this approach solves interesting problem in front end, and that maybe, it gives you some thought for how you can solve some of your other problems in computer science with something different. So usually when you're working in design, well, when you get a design from a designer, you would get like an element, like a bunch of elements, and you can imagine a team page where each team member gets a photo, a name, and like a bio paragraph. And since it's a naming issue, we need to kind of name this group of elements somehow. And I decided to name them here like a card, just kind of following the material design pattern that's common these days. And then, the second thing happens, and, a designer comes and says, okay, I kind of like this design. Let's use the same design, but use it for testimonials on the homepage. So we go, okay, that's kind of similar. We have a photo, we have a name on the bottom where we sign the testimonial, and there's like the bio, it's testimonial in this case. And of course, this being a testimonial, it might have a different background or a bit of different design changes. So suddenly it's not a card anymore, but it's like card, and then we rename the first one, and we say this is a card for a person, and we give a name to the second one, and we call that card for testimonial. And of course, this being live, of course, the designer comes and says, you know what, we also have a third, second type of testimonial, and here we put a photo on the left. And you go, okay, cool, let's figure out how do we name this. And it's still a card, it's a card for testimonial, and it's a card photo on the left. And if you write CSS, you usually kind of name these things this way, because the idea is that you want to cascade your classes. So common card things go into card class, and then like kind of specific things for like card person. Let's say you have a light gray background for a person, so that would go into card person. And testimonials maybe, has a blue background, so that would go into card testimonial. And in that regard, it kind of works very similar to, for example, Python classes, where you can kind of mix in different additions. But of course, what do we do about the third one? And this is like the issue with naming things is, we either focus on the, photo on the left part, or we say, oh, that's a special case for a testimonial. So the whole issue that you suddenly have to decide where you're architecting your front end, and actually even the same thing happens when you're writing Python classes, is what's the difference? Like, what's the common top level abstract object, and how do you override it? Because obviously you don't want to, so you need to figure out what's the correct level of granularity, like where do you make changes and so on. And I'm sure, like, if we would make a poll here, some people would like option 1, some people would like option 2, and we can probably figure out another 3 or 4 options. So there's no correct answer in a way. And if you would write this as a CSS HTML, on top, that's like the HTML structure, and let's say that's one way to write this as a CSS solution. And here I'm kind of using the BAM syntax, where you kind of prefix or postfix with the 2 underscores, each top level, so things are a bit more readable. So what does Tailwind do? Tailwind basically then comes and extract all those CSS definitions, and it's like a giant, let's say 5 megabyte CSS file with all those class names. So in this case, .card CSS class would be named, you would just write flex and flex call, and it will kind of pull in those CSS classes. Same for margin and so on. So your CSS on the left, you actually write it in a way that's on the right. So you just write CSS classes. And that actually brings us to like some interesting effects if you kind of give yourself this kind of constraints. Because it's a framework that comes with a very opinionated default structure, it kind of limits you, or it doesn't limit you, but it strongly suggests how you should structure your front-end visual star. So let's say you have a margin, and you would kind of use the grid that sits on the left side to say, you know, -4 is always 1 rem, and 1 rem is usually like 16 pixels. So you don't have cases, you usually don't have cases then where you would have like, oh, this margin is 17 pixels and this margin is like 18 and so on. And that greatly simplifies a lot of design decisions and so on. Same things happen with colors. Usually when you get like a designer would sometimes use a palette, but usually they would just pick colors, especially for things like borders and dividers and so on, and then you would just end up like with 6 or 8 different grays. So it's kind of gives you another constraint. So that kind of brings us into some interesting things around whole framework, the things like that, right? It's really hard to find a balance. And it's kind of interesting to say, oh, somebody else already did this for me, and I'm just kind of lean into this kind of framework and only kind of use my own classes when it makes sense. Otherwise, I'm just going to do that. It also kind of changes the scope of my decisions, since I don't have to kind of reason instead of about the whole structure and the project, but I can just kind of say, oh, you know, this is like a React component, or this is like a small Django template, and it's going to be self-composed. And I'm not going to worry about how cards or different display units are done across my whole project. I'm just going to be like, okay, this is self-contained project, and I'm not going to worry about relation to other so much. It still presents a problem. So how do I then bring a unified approach? But then you can use like different tools, like maybe you have visual, or maybe you have another approach, but you don't do that as a cascading CSS layer. And lastly, like the multiple possible approaches, like it's interesting to look at like, okay, can I solve one layer like this? So for example, here, when we would have like photo left, maybe we can say, you know, it's a card and a card testimonial, which it makes sense to have a reusable component, but then the photo positioning could be overwritten with a utility CSS class. So it kind of gives us ability to mix and match. And I think lastly, for me, it's interesting, just like, you know, I think kind of use the same approach that Otto had with his talk, was like, oh, let's learn something new. Let's figure out what's happening. Let's try this on a project, and then only then figure out, okay, does that benefit my, you know, bigger commercial projects and so on. And it's interesting to see like Tailwind CSS is something that's been in active development now for, I think, 2 years, and it has a huge community engagement. So for me, it was like, oh, why is this team of people investing so much time and talking about it, making YouTube videos, podcasts? What do they, you know, what did they figure out that I don't understand yet? So instead of saying, oh, this doesn't work, it's like, okay, let's see, let's listen, let's learn. and let's make a decision then within my development team. There's also like a lot of patterns of how things should be done, like don't repeat yourself, keep it simple, and so on. And sometimes it makes sense, but then other times, like when the more development you do, the more you figure out like, oh, okay, that's maybe it works like if it's like academic paper, or if somebody's making a medium.com blog, how it should be done. But as as the project evolves, or you're still learning about business requirements, those patterns sometimes are just much more, they're not useful. And you just need to hack something together, ship it, and see if it sells. Otherwise, there's no point. So this kind of pragmatism. And that's about it. Like, we can have some Q&A. And I'd be interested to hear if you're wondering, if you have any questions.
Can I go?
Yep.
This syntax that you showed in the table reminds me,
this one?
This one, yeah, reminds me of Bootstrap. Do you know, are they in any way connected, or did somebody take some inspiration from other project or anything like that?
So this, I mean, obviously all these projects look and investigate how they do stuff. Bootstrap, I'm not sure about the version 4 and 5, but initially it's like one layer higher. So it kind of comes with buttons and patterns for how things should look. And this is one layer lower. It's like a bunch of utility functions that you're expected then to also have your own design that you implement.
Yeah, sure. Just the way that it looks. So that you used m minus something, and this means that it's of a certain width, and it just reminded me of how.
Yeah, there are like a few other CSS utility projects that people have been experimenting with for a few years. So there, and it makes sense, like you don't really want to redefine margin into another abbreviation.
Thank you.
Yeah, Matjaž says that Bootstrap might have been inspired by Tailwind, and that Material UI has this as well.